Hey everyone, it is Luke Frye, Washington CPA and co-founder of TimberTax, and today we are going to talk more about the Payroll Protection Program. I'll also go over some of the other just general information as a lot of these deadlines have changed. So if you're one of our clients, you also should have received an email if we haven't filed your return asking you to pick your filing date, and that really is meant to just get us aligned on what our priorities are as far as when you're expecting to have things done and when we'll get it done. And in many cases, that's just going to be the date when we'll have a draft to you and not necessarily an actual meeting. But if you have any questions about it, just be sure to reach out and we'll do our best to coordinate that. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. Remember, the deadline was extended to July 15th, and that's for 2019 payments and filings for 1040. So if you're a sole proprietor, single member LLC, not taxed as an S corporation. Also, there was no Q1 deadline, so Q1 and Q2 are now July 15th. That means you probably have a bigger chunk that you're going to end up owing, but also I'm assuming that your revenues have been down quite a bit, so maybe not. So July 15th is the deadline. And in order to make sure that we file on time, we really need everything by June 15th if you're hoping to file by then at the very latest. Ideally May 31st, which gives you 10 days. So make sure you check your client portal and upload anything there and reach out to us if you have any questions. Also, if you are working with us on a second quarter projection where we're actually going to be calculating what you owe, then we need to make sure we get all that information as well by June 15th. So that means we want your May financials. So Q2 usually would be due June 15th. This time it's going to be due on July 15th, and we want to use your May financials. So we want everything for the second quarter, which really is going to include first quarter of 2020 as well, by June 15th, which gives us enough time to work through everything, answer questions, and get you good, reliable numbers. I'll talk a little bit more about the PPP forgiveness. Oh, thanks for letting me know. It's hard to hear. I know I'm set up a little bit differently. There. Oh, maybe it's my computer. Thanks for letting me know. I'm going to assume that you can hear me better now. I'll assume that you can. So essentially, the PPP Forgiveness Application has been released, and this is something that is exciting on one level, but the other reality is that we're also in the middle of just figuring this all out together, because the application, like the law, was made fairly quickly and released out as well. So with the application, I posted it on the Facebook channel, and we've had time to look through it. If you haven't already, I would recommend looking through it. And it will be a lot different for sole proprietors than it will be for anyone who's an S corporation or has employees. So the good news is we made it past the hurdles of applying and then getting approved and getting funded. And now the next thing is, you're going to need to spend the money in the right way, and you're going to need to make sure it's documented properly. The next step would be to apply for actual forgiveness, which, we're figuring this out along with you, and we don't know exactly the best way to help yet, but if you have questions, it's always good just to reach out. We can either set up a consultation, or we could also work towards setting up a workshop to do it more all at the same time. So really, the first part is getting the money and then spending it properly, documenting it, which I'll talk about a little bit more shortly, to make sure that you're going to be eligible for as much as possible. The other point to remember is if you got funded for PPP and were also on unemployment, you need to go off of unemployment now. That means at least for the 8-week period that's covering your the PPP term, you want to go off of unemployment. If you still need to have unemployment after that 8 weeks, then you should go back on it. Because the 850 seconds is what will be forgiven, there may be some adjustments to that. Just make sure you're really clear when you're submitting any sort of your weekly claims. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about how to document your transactions for forgiveness. So we work with people who are in a lot of different bookkeeping softwares, maybe Bench, Xero, QuickBooks, but they all have the ability to track things in either tracking categories, classes, or tags. And so what we're recommending is everyone book the initial deposit to a PPP liability account, so a loan on your balance sheet. So that will remain on the balance sheet as money you owe until you apply for and get official forgiveness of that loan. Once you have the money in that account, in that loan account, we also recommend, if you didn't already open a separate savings account with your bank, I would go ahead and open a separate savings account, transfer all of the cash over to that account. So we want to try and make sure that we have as much documentation as possible, because the more proof, the easier it's going to be to make sure that everything is forgiven. So as far as having that separate account goes, the idea is just to have only activity related to the PPP loan in that account. So transfer everything to that account, and then as a sole proprietor, you're just going to be transferring half of what you received to yourself personally in May, and then half of what you received personally in June. If you're an employer who has employees on payroll, there is a little bit of a different situation for you, because there's this idea of your pay periods, and sometimes it may not match up perfectly. There is some relief mentioned in the application that talks about paid or accrued, meaning it doesn't seem like it's going to be as essential to match it exactly day by day, so you don't have to run a specific odd payroll cycle as long as you have accrued the payroll, so if you earned it. Yes, I'm seeing some suggestions about the separate checking account. Yes, if your bank is going to be charging you for transactions on a savings account, absolutely open a checking account. Also, you should really be getting this for free. Banks make money off of having money. So if you're putting money into their institution and they're charging you for it, I would offer to find a new bank if they're not willing to give you a very good or cheap rate. So make sure that you have it in a separate account, and then you're tagging each transaction as PPP. Then the reality is, because nobody has done this before and we're all going to be figuring it out together, certainly you can count on us to help walk you through the process, but rather than give you absolute certain answers, I'm going to recommend that general principles. You should be tracking your use of the money to be at least 75% for payroll. That means owner draw, or it means actual, payroll through Gusto or that sort of a thing. So in that case, there is going to remain some uncertainty, and if you're on the fence about what it is, feel free to ask, but also in the interest of being just safer than sorry, I might recommend just not using that money for it. But then when we actually submit the application, it's possible that you would get approved for that amount. So again, in your books, make sure that there's a loan account for PPP loan. It's a liability on your balance sheet. And then you make sure that anything that you spend out of it is tagged PPP. And then we leave that whole balance on the loan until you receive forgiveness. I also recommend that you have a separate account. Checking is fine, where you're putting all of the money and then you just transfer it out as you use it. The final step of this process will be applying with your lender. And remember, every lender, especially if you applied for multiple loans, every lender had a little bit of a different process initially, and that's going to be the same way when you ultimately apply for the forgiveness. There'll be a slightly different process, I'm sure. But I would strongly encourage you all to take a look at this application and read through it and ask any questions about the application. Again, if you're a sole proprietor, qualified joint venture, single member LLC, not as an S corporation, it's probably going to be more simple for you. And then remember, the intent of the law was to keep people off of unemployment and paid. So in the past, I think we've talked about this a little bit, but try to avoid any sort of an idea where you're trying to game the system. If you're trying to be too opportunistic, it will probably backfire on you. So if you were going to pay rent anyway, just pay rent anyway. If you're going to pay your employees anyway, pay your employees anyway. And I say that just because there is a level of uncertainty. The good news is if your loan weren't forgiven, that means everything that you use it for should be theoretically tax deductible. But if it is forgiven, remember that means it's not tax deductible, which means you still owe a percentage of what you received on that money. So it's not even if you got $20,000 and it was all forgiven, it's still after tax. It might be more like you received 16 or something like that. Okay, so I think unless there's any other questions from everybody, either on Instagram or on Facebook, I will leave it there. And it would be really helpful to know if you're interested in more of a workshop to go through how to apply for forgiveness, or if you're thinking it would be better to do one-on-ones. And again, remember those due dates of May 31st and June 15th for your filing. So May 31st is when we really need everything to do your July 15th filing. Otherwise, we're going to need to extend it. And then June 15th is when we need to make sure we have everything for your second quarter projection. So that means you have a little bit of time for the second quarter projection, and that should help you know where you stand for the year. As always, feel free to add any additional questions, send me emails. Our goal is really to make sure that you have the help that you need. Thanks so much.